Thanks for joining us. Thanks, Nick, for having us. On the little sheet he sends out, I was listed as the host. I don't think that means anything. If it does, you are all in trouble. But I do get to introduce you guys. You probably know Kevin Hasting from right here on this very site. Pitcher List, he does the On the Wire podcast, which we're going to be talking about things on the wire, kind of. Kevin, welcome. Thanks for being here. And then we
Dave.
have
It's great to be here.
Yeah, you probably know from the NFBC from winning the online auction championship last year. Now with FTN Fantasy doing his baseball analysis over there, we got Lucas Biery with his fancy hair. Hello, Lucas.
Hey, Dave. Great to be on with you and Kevin, and really excited.
Yeah, this is great. So we're going to talk about FAAB, and as much as possible, like most of what happens in FAAB is kind of, you can't really get too much into it until the season starts. Like everything is kind of theoretical until you're sitting there with your team on the day that FAAB is happening. But what I'm hoping we can do is give some sort of useful tools, tips, things we do every week, things that maybe streamline your process, help you not overlook things, that kind of thing. So for a very basic start, tell me, how many leagues, FAAB leagues, roughly, do you guys have in a year? Like, how many teams are you doing FAAB on? Kevin, we start over there.
Oh, the last couple of years, it's been probably 7 or 8, and I'm looking to keep it at 1 or 2 under that this year. Probably do a couple of more draft champions leagues and maybe another best ball or two. And have the same number of leagues, but I'm probably going to drop down 1 or 2 leagues on the FAAB side. Definitely keep it more at like 6 or 7.
Yeah, it's a lot to do it, right? What about you, Lucas?
I'm cutting back a little bit. I'll have about 4, maybe 5 if you count the solo shot contest, since that's a monthly FAAB. But yeah, I think 4 or 5 is perfect for me. I don't have any kids yet, and that is a big factor, obviously. So
yeah, they are terrible. Kids are the worst. You're not missing anything, I assure you. So yeah, I used to back in the day. My earbuds keep trying to fall out on me. Back in the day, I used to do like 30 or 40 FAAB leagues, because I was a crazy person. I'm down to 2 now, trying to get it down to 0. But 2 is doable. But so I want to start like we'll skip the very basic, like this is what FAAB is. If you're listening to a fantasy baseball webcast in January, you know what's going on. But like, do you have a very specific process, like a step-by-step, like things you do every single week on every single team to sort of get yourself organized, get things going, make sure you don't miss anything? Lucas, let me start with you. Like, first of all, do you go like, is it you do one team at a time, or is it sort of all together? And like, what are your steps that you make sure you're not going to miss every week when you sit down?
Yeah, so I go one team at a time, and I really kind of learn from Scott Genstead. He kind of talked through his process. He goes ahead and he sets his lineup for the next week. So let's say he's got tons of middle infield. Well, he doesn't have to devote his attention there since we all have limited time throughout the weekend. So yeah, I pretty much try to set my lineup in advance. If I have a few floating spots or debatable guys, if they're in the lineup or if not, kind of keep track of that. And then I try to go into the FAAB weekend for that particular team with a shopping list kind of what I need. So yeah, that's kind of one of the bigger keys is I don't look at every single player. I kind of have goals as far as each team. But since I have 4 or 5 FAAB teams, I usually know what's out there for all the positions because I'll probably need a little bit of everything across the weekend.
Yeah. What about you, Kevin? What does your process look like?
Yeah, similar. Try to spread it out throughout the week. That can save a lot of headaches come the weekend. I kind of look at it both ways. Per team, what are my needs for each team? Also, there's some guys I'm going to check and see if they're available on every team, depending on their matchups and such. So kind of look at it from both ends a little bit. One new thing I'm incorporating is I believe I'm going to do my 12 team and my 15 team leagues on different days this coming season. I think that's going to be a big help. I think it's a complete different mentality and trying to do them both on the same days in the past, I think is causing me some issues. So I think splitting up my 12 and 15 team leagues is going to be a big help.
Yeah, that's something I was going to ask later. Like 15s and 12s and any other formats, like pool is so different. Like I highly recommend splitting them up. So a couple of things that I do every week when I go team by team, it is sort of a week-long process, and we'll get into what we do during the week, but it's essentially like 4 steps that I'm going to make sure I do kind of in order. Like I look at a team, and the very first thing I do, kind of like you mentioned, Lucas, like set your lineup. Like if I don't make any moves, what does my lineup look like? And step 1 is simply, it seems obvious, but I've missed it myself amazingly. Like make sure you have every single spot filled with someone that you're willing to play. Like it seems easy and basic, but like if you only do one thing all year, just do that and you'll at least survive. Like, so I look at, do I absolutely have to have a replacement? Like if I don't get a second catcher, then I don't have a catcher. That's the first thing. Second thing is I go through and decide, are there any players that I for sure want to cut? Like I have no need for this guy anymore. I used to kind of run into a thing where I would have players I definitely didn't want on my team, but then there wouldn't be players I was thrilled about getting. And so I would just kind of blah and leave this terrible player on my team. I could have picked up somebody slightly better for $1. Like it's worth doing that. And then I break into the, okay, what players do I want to add to my team? And then that gets into the process of how do you decide who you want to cut. But that really basic, like make sure all your spots are filled. And when it comes to pitcher spots, filled with people that you are willing to play, like be a little picky on your pitcher. If it's NFBC, like sometimes when I set that initial lineup, like my 8th or 9th pitcher, if I'm really being honest, I would rather just play a guy who's on the bench and not going to pitch to ruin me that week. So make sure you got your spots filled. It seems basic, but I've missed it before. I've shown up, right before lock. I'm going to set my lineup and like, oh, I don't have a middle infielder who's not on the IL this week. So moving on to sort of some tools, we're going to talk mostly NFBC, but any other sites you guys play on, there's a lot of things that NFBC has done in the last 3 or 4 years to make free agent bidding a lot easier for multiple teams, even for one team, but especially for multiple teams. Do you guys use like the watch list or like the bid copying tools that they have? Any of that stuff? Or are you just kind of one team at a time, or like, do you use that stuff, Kevin?
Oh, I've definitely tried those new features that they've added over the past couple of seasons, and they're great. Like with anything, it takes some getting used to. I mean, I've had people point out I rave about the NFBC's FAAB process as a whole all the time, but I've had people point out that when you first do it, it takes some getting used to, like anything. So that is true. I think once it's figured out that it's head and shoulders above other formats, and these new tools you're bringing up can be a big help, they also take some getting used to and incorporating them into your process. If it doesn't work as slick right away as you thought it might, oh, I'm just going to go back and do this my old way. But the copying bids, that was just new, I believe, last season. If not, it's only been a couple of years. That's been great to copy bids over and then see, kind of like what I was talking earlier about. I like to look at things from both ends. Like, what does my team specifically need, and are there players I want to look and see, check on their availability for every league? That copying bids really helps with that aspect. So yeah, I'm trying to incorporate them all, and like anything, the more you get used to it, the better it is.
Yeah. Lucas, I mean, if you won an overall championship in the NFBC, I assume you use some fancy tools. Like, do you use like do you watch list players? Do you use the copy bid? Any of that?
Yeah, I do the watch list, but I usually don't keep it too full for too long, just because sometimes those fringe guys can just be worthless in a few weeks. So I try to kind of manage it pretty regularly. One thing that's, and I don't really do like the bid on the player for multiple teams. I don't really do that because I kind of go team by team. But one thing that I do love to use that they added fairly recently is if you just click on one of the players in the free agent pool, you can see how your bids are looking on your other leagues. So if, let's say, a Bobby Miller was out there, you could just adjust your bids for your other leagues on that player card. And if you're doing like last second, just double checks, that can be nice if there's a relevant player that's going to be bid on across all your leagues. That's pretty nifty.
Yeah. In my initial plan for being the air quotes host of this here show, I was going to like do a screen share and show you how to do some of these things. I couldn't find my way to get onto a team to a free agent page to show you, but there are some. I know even on if you Google it, like I know Vlad on FTN had an article like last year or the year before where he kind of took some screenshots of what these things look like. So it's out there if you don't know what we're talking about. Make sure you like just play with these tools, and it once you get used to them, they're all amazing. But even for me, like I still kind of don't know what I'm doing. I'll do the watch list, and like 4 weeks later, I'm like, I still have this goofy guy on my watch list. So you kind of have to keep up with it. But it's very useful if you have multiple teams. So moving on to a little more in the dirt kind of stuff. Do you guys, it might be league specific, do you have budget goals? If you're talking about $1,000 like the NFBC budget, I know some people who have very specific, like I want to have $400 left at the All-Star break, or I want to have $92 left going into September. Or I want to use 8% of my budget. Like I know some really nerdy people. We all do. I am not one of those. I'm a very cool person. But do you guys have these sort of goals going in, or these guidelines? Like you don't want to have spent too much by a certain point, or is it like, hey, if you come out in April and you need something, there's stuff there, you're just going to blow it all? How nitty gritty do you get on trying to come up with a budget, Kevin?
I start off with a budget that seems like it's pretty strict, but then I'm very lenient with it throughout the season. The part that I do remain strict on is for the last 2-3 weeks of the season, I want to be able to bid $2 on about 4 players if I need them. So I'm making sure I'm saving $8 to $10 in $1,000 FAAB league. I am making sure that I do save $8 to $10 for the last couple of weeks, bumping that up a little bit as the time gets back. I'm taking a couple hundred off the top at the beginning of the season. That's my one big jump. Maybe it's a couple of medium-sized jumps if I want them. And then that's leaving me roughly $30 a week. That's my budget. I'm very lenient with that. If I need a little more one week than another, I'll use it. If I don't need it all, that's great. Then I can jump on a bigger player, or maybe after a few weeks and a completely extra larger bid player. But I start off with a fairly strict budget, but then I'm really lenient with it on a weekly basis, as long as I'm saving my money for the end.
Yeah. Before I move on to Lucas, one thing I want to just kind of highlight that you said, it's very similar to how I feel actually like doing an auction draft, like at the draft table. There's a ginormous difference when you get right down to the end in those last couple of weeks and you're fighting for a spot or two in RBIs or steals. You're like, there's a huge difference between having $1 to bid on a player, $2 to bid on a player. Even in FAAB, it matters. So like kind of what you said there, if you can make that work, that extra couple bucks really matters those last few weeks when some people are really down to $1. So how about you, Lucas?
Oh yeah, I completely agree on that. Even just a $2 bid is going to trump almost everyone. So absolutely. I don't really have a strict budget that I adhere to, but every single week during FAAB for all my teams, I'm always seeing where I'm at in relation to the other teams. And I really don't want to be in like the bottom 5 or bottom 7. Hopefully I can stay towards the top just to give myself more outs as the season progresses. And if I can have a week where I don't have to spend too much money, I view that as a nice bonus, because ideally I can go into mid-August to late September with $100. I think even 75 would be more than enough. So, yeah.
Yeah. So let's while we're at this point, let me kind of move on to something else that you mentioned earlier today, Lucas. Like I do kind of like Kevin said, I've got a budget idea, but it kind of doesn't mean anything once you get a couple months. Like you got to fix your team, right? And what's there is there. But like, how much are you watching the other teams in your league? Um, we'll start with to set a budget, and then we'll start with how you use that to make your bids. But that's kind of where I end up is my budget means less once I see where everyone else in my league is with their leftover money. Ideally, I don't want to run out of money before everyone else, obviously. But really, until there's someone that I really desperately want, if I can keep the hammer, I'm going to keep it as long as I possibly can. Like it really is pretty fantastic. If you get to point in the year, if you're not struggling and you've got more FAAB money than anyone, it doesn't even matter what the amount is at that point. Like in one league, you might need $700. In one league, $400 could have the same sort of effect in that league. So are you sort of following the teams in your league to set your own budget as you go along? You kind of already mentioned that, Lucas, but how about you, Kevin? Does that sort of change your budget as the year goes?
Absolutely. It really helps me adjust things as the season goes on, keeping an eye on how that works out over the first few weeks of the season. I think by, you know, definitely by the All-Star break and even a little earlier, you have a really good idea of how things are going to in general shake out down the stretch of the season. So who you're competing against and paying attention to uh the amount of FAAB budget they have remaining can be very useful. Also, how they've been spending it. As the season goes on, I know these types of things can help us as much early in the season as they do late, but we don't know as much early in the season. So as the season goes on, I start looking at that more and more.
Yeah. So kind of digging in on this topic a little more, what you find in the NFBC is like each sort of category of type of player within each league sort of ends up setting its own parameters. Like when that first new closer comes out, I really don't want to be the person to set the high bid on that unless it's just a wildly desperate need and I believe in that guy.
Mhm.
Like if that first fresh new closer goes for $250 in one league and $180 in the next league, like that's sort of that league's price for a new closer for the whole year all of a sudden. Like, and you see the same kind of thing with like sort of middling to start pitchers that anyone's going to want to pick up this guy for this week, but where no one's going to want to keep him. The first few times those guys come out, that sort of sets the budget on mediocre two-star pitchers for the whole year. And you can sort of start to judge like, okay, the Patrick Corbin, who nobody wants your team, but he's got two good starts. Okay, he goes for $18. Well, the next week, the random two-start mediocre pitcher is going to go for like $18 or something like that. So my goal is early on, like I don't want to be the one who sets that number if I don't really want the guy. It's like I want to be able to sit back and see where everyone's bidding and decide that, okay, everyone in this league is overpaying for this. So if I don't desperately need it, I'm just not going to worry about it. I'm not going to try to match that bid level. Is that something you guys notice? And how do you feel about sort of being the first one in on, okay, I'm going to get this first closer, but it's kind of a wild guess as to in one league he's going to cost 350 and the other league he's going to cost 175. Lucas, what do you think about that?
Yeah, that's very interesting. I have not been able to get that granular with noticing exactly that because it seems like FAAB varies so much league to league and bid to bid, but that certainly is one way to kind of bucket players, look at archetypes, and kind of use the historical bidding for that league for moving forward. So no, that's really good information.
It kind of hit me a couple years ago when I like tracked it through a couple leagues. It was kind of mind boggling.
Wow.
Like
Okay.
how the buckets of players like lock in a league. I mean, it doesn't always go that way, but it's kind of wild.
Yeah, I'd never thought of it that way.
You notice that phenomenon, Kevin?
Yeah,
I don't know if it's a
little
phenomenon.
bit.
I don't know if I can. Well, I'm really naming things phenomenal.
Yeah, the tendencies of
There you
players
go.
in
I
each
like
league
that.
are different, and that's what you just kind of mentioned as a side note as you were bringing it up. When you started tracking these things, I think that can be such a big help, and it's not like keeping track of every single move every player makes, but just a few notes on each league, how the FAAB ran each week that you have that you can go back and review of the last couple of weeks when you're doing the new week. It can be extremely helpful, and you find those patterns like that you're talking about. Absolutely.
Yep. When a Hall of Famer asks a question in the chat, you got to bring it up. Sean Childs, never heard of him, says, "What about looking at runner-up bids?" And that actually could be anyone. You can enter whatever name you want on the chat. The odds of that being at the Sean Childs, it's about 1 in 10. But okay, so one aside to this bucketing of players, the first closer goes for 350. It can happen that if that first closer comes out and he goes for 350, but the secondary bid, the runner-up bid, was like 175, and like is a clear overpay. It can come down the next time. Whereas when it's the $18 2-star pitcher, I mean, there's only so much room. I try. That's kind of part of the reason, obviously, why I don't want to be the first guy in on one of these things, because I know that I'm probably going to get it wrong. You don't want to overpay by $200 ever, but especially early in the season. How closely do you guys analyze runner-up bids, either on bids that you've gotten or bids that you haven't? Is that something that you spend a lot of time worrying about, Lucas?
Yeah, definitely. I think so. Kind of like you said, it shows you how close you need to be the next time around. And naturally, of course, month into the season, people have needs. They see they're in 8th, 10th place. The bidding is going to come down. So yeah, I meant to say naturally, like it'll just come down because people are using their money. So as far as avoiding that overbid and kind of checking out the runner-ups, I think you can lower your bidding amounts that way.
Yeah, and that is another point. There's sort of a sliding down as the season moves on, as people run out of money. When I say, okay, we've set the price on this kind of thing. Once you get to about the All-Star break and people have used 70% of the budget, everything kind of takes a step down, but it's incremental and it's kind of league by league. It still keeps the same general order of what's going for more than something else. Are you concerned with the runner-up bids, Kevin?
Yeah, definitely. It's something I like to keep an eye on, and it's not kind of like what you just alluded to this as well. It's not the big bids, the big breakout player that everybody wants and going for hundreds of dollars. So the bigger you get, the bigger gaps you're going to get in bids. And so I don't get all bent out of shape whether I'm on the good end or the bad end of a player goes for 300 and the runner-up bid was 120. It's more on the things that I'm doing on a weekly basis. My good setup relievers on good teams that have a lot of games that week. So I want this guy in my lineup. The guys that the middling 2-start pitchers, starters like you've been bringing up. What is the going rate on those guys? And like you said earlier, you can usually find a market of what these guys are going to be from week to week. And that's what's really more valuable to me, because those are the bids I'm making each and every week throughout the season.
Yeah. Something else I kind of skipped over on my own notes in the budgeting. After I draft my team, and you sit back and you look at your team and you find your own sort of weak spots. Like every team you draft is going to have something that you're missing. It might be a category you're missing or a position you're low on. I do try to figure out, is this a team where I'm going to be streaming starters all year? If so, you need to set aside more of your budget to chase these 2-star pitchers. Mm-hmm. Or if this is a league where you didn't get saves, well, you have to move up your budget in that. So I do completely change my idea of where I'm going to spend my money based on what the team looks like. But I try to set that up before I start bidding the first week. Like I try to have in my mind, like, okay, this team, I'm going to be chasing strikeouts all year. So I know I can't spend all my money on hitters or I'm not going to be able to get these 2-star guys. Like, do you ever separate it out like that? Like, okay, I know this team's going to need saves, so I'm going to have to plan to spend $300 on saves. Whereas this other league, I hope to spend $0 on saves. Is that something you're going to look at immediately?
Yeah, for me, I had a team, and coming out of the auction, my outfield was bad. It was worse than I expected, and I was aggressive on outfielders specifically. So I had some solid high purchases early on in the year. So absolutely, I think you can get a feel for where you're going to be weak. You might be wrong every once in a while, but I think your instincts will be correct if you're being honest with your assessment.
Same for you, Kevin.
Yeah, and the other thing with that, this is tough in a league with an overall, but when you're just playing to compete and or win a league, the earlier you can determine that you don't have a realistic chance to compete in a category, the better. Because while you're still trying to compete, you're wasting resources there. You could be performing much better in other categories if you go ahead and embrace the fact that you're going to end up punting one. So the earlier you can make that determination in the season, the better.
Yeah, I think that's big key. It's most often going to be either saves or steals, where it's like there's this one category that you can spend a bunch of money on. And if you've been playing long enough, you've done it where you just blow like all your money chasing these saves that never come, and you didn't really have a chance to compete anyway. Like that's the worst possible use of FAAB money. I know that because I've done that. You can kind of do the same thing with speed. It is, yeah, there's a point where you say, I'm being silly to say, oh, if I spend $400 and get 2 closers, all of a sudden I'm going to be better. It may not even help you. So yeah, something to keep an eye on, which is just yet another reason why, like, I don't want to be the guy who sets the early market on blowing all this money on, especially on a one-trick pony, like a saves guy or a speed guy. If it is like the one thing, like you have a perfect team except for this one thing, and you think you have like, this is the guy that can fix it, it may just be worth that shot. And if it doesn't work out, well, you can play again next year. But as much as possible, like, I just want to wait and let other people set kind of silly benchmarks on players that aren't really any better than what you're going to get next month anyway. So speaking of that, I want to skip to what we do with the shiny new toys. Every year there's going to be these rookies that come up that are potential league changers, and some of them work out, some of them don't work out. What I want to know from you guys, like when there's like Ellie De La Cruz comes up, or like, all the pitchers came up last year near the same time, like Biery and the Millers and all this stuff. Do you decide, okay, this rookie, I believe in this rookie's skills. I think he's the next big thing. This is the guy I'm going to bid on. You're going to bid on him in all your leagues. Or is it like league specific still, like with other players, where, okay, I need pitching, I'll bid on Biery, or I need speed, I'll bid on Ellie. But if you don't need pitching, you're not going to take, even if you think Tanner Biery's the next big thing, if you weren't bidding on pitchers anyway, you're not going to bid on him. To me, this is like the part, all these other players, it's like you have needs and you have to bid on what your needs are. But with these guys who they're going to go for $300 or so, are you trying to determine this guy is the real deal? I want him everywhere. I'm going to spend everywhere I can get him. I'm going to get him. or are you still going team specific on these potential game changers? How about you, Kevin?
This is very team specific for me because as great as any player may be, even if they perform to the highest level that you're hoping for, some teams that might not help me much. I might already be okay. And sure, we have enough multi-position eligible players these days. We can move things around. We can get guys in our lineup. And a guy that good is going to help any team. But he's going to help some of my teams a whole lot more than others. So it's very team specific for me in that situation. I really want to try to figure out just how much they're going to be able to improve my team.
What about you, Lucas? You feel the same?
Yeah, I feel a lot of similarities there with Kevin. That team specific need is important. Also, budgetary needs is huge too. I only had enough money on one team to get Ellie De La Cruz last year, and the other teams I just didn't have enough. And funny enough, other teams he was drafted, dropped, and picked up in early May. So sometimes the inventory is not there. But the most exception that I could see moving forward for me is if a pitcher is coming out there, just because we can always use that insurance or depth. So yeah.
Yeah. So I've sort of changed on this over the years. Back in the day, Lucas, back, long before you were here with your fancy hair, like I would never pick up any rookie ever because I just hate them all. And then one day I realized like I was going way overboard, like hoarding money for later in the season for kind of nonsense. And so generally speaking, if it's like May or June, which is usually when a lot of these prospects come up, I sort of feel like there's no team that that I don't want a potential best player of all time. Obviously, I'm exaggerating, but like when I go back at the end of the year and look at who did I bid on this year, like it's just this long list of like garbage. Like it's okay. I got Nick Markakis for 2 weeks here to fill a spot, and I got 7 number 2 catchers going here, and then I picked up Patrick Corbin 14 times. And so I started just, I don't know, putting a lot more of my budget on, I want to get 1 or 2 players that might have been like 3rd round draft picks that can just completely change my whole team. And then therefore spending a lot less on all the other nonsense. Like when I need a 5th outfielder for a couple of weeks, I'm only going to spend $1, and I'm just going to, if I get the 10th guy in my list instead of the 2nd, that's what I'm going to do.
Yep.
And to do that, like I'm trying to be picky on, I'm not just like, oh, there's a rookie that came up, let me spend on him. Like I've got to think potentially like this is the one guy that it could happen where he would have been worth a 1st round draft pick and I can get him in season. So like last year I did that with Ellie De La Cruz. I happened to have money because I hadn't spent it. And so I had the hammer in those leagues and I used it. But that's kind of a personal thing because I know how much money I waste on silly players who just aren't that good.
Yeah.
So that's something I've been trying to do in my own game recently is just take some swings because I miss on the bad swings too. So, I'd rather miss on something that at least had potential to be good. But kind of what I was most interested from you guys is if it's like, if you believe for whatever reason, this guy is it. Like for me, I want him on every team, regardless of if I think I need him or not. And sometimes it misses and oh, well. Okay. So let's talk about injured players. The bench spots in general, but specifically injured players and or severely underperforming veterans who were, maybe not like early picks, but like, you draft them in the 10th round. They're just not good anymore. But specifically injured players. Like, do you have any actual process besides just how do I feel this week to decide when you drop an injured player? Like, is it just straight up how long he's going to be out, or is it how good might he still be when he comes back? Like, let's say it's someone you drafted in the first 10 rounds and he's out for 2 months. Like, do you have an actual process to decide when you're going to cut him? Because for me, it's just this random, well, how do I feel about cutting him? And I feel like one of you should give me a better idea than that on how to figure that out. What do you do, Lucas?
Yeah, so I think you named kind of the two bigger aspects as far as how long is this guy going to be out. Let's always be a little bit slightly pessimistic on his return table too. And also, what is his impact as far as when he comes back and what type of league is it? Obviously, in a 12-team league, you can be very aggressive there. I had Max Fried in a 12-team league, and he had a forearm strain. Who knew how long he was going to be out? So that was an easy cut, and I didn't miss him whatsoever because I was able to find other guys. But in a 15-team league, either dropping him or Brandon Woodruff, I don't know what the right answer would have been since those are such high-end picks in a 15-teamer. So the easy answer is in a 12-team, you can be cut crazy, but I don't necessarily have a better answer compared to what you had laid out there, Dave.
Okay, you did not fix that for me. All right, Kevin, fix it. Fix it. What do I do?
I have gotten better at this, cutting guys sooner. I'm still not good enough, and I don't think there are very many of us that are. I think almost all of us hold guys too long. Especially you said a guy in the first 10 rounds and a guy and out 2 months was your example. A guy towards the later end of that, 7, 8, 9th round, 2 months, we should be cutting those guys right away, in my opinion, even in 15s. I think we're underestimating the value of that roster spot, especially hitters that for the weekend, just making sure we have more backups in FBC formats, right? I think it's a huge deal when something happens the first half of the week and you don't have a backup player you can slide in there for the 3-day weekend. That's just a horrible feeling.
Yeah.
You should be able to fix that, and you can't, because this guy I drafted in the 9th round, and I might get him back in mid-August, and he's sitting here on my bench in June. I've gotten better, but I'm still not good enough, and I think very few of us are at letting those guys go.
I think
that's the TED Talk I needed to hear. Yeah.
I think to piggyback a little bit off what Kevin said, I think he said it perfectly. We need to start cutting more guys more aggressively, giving yourself those chances to find players that can be an upgrade or even an immediate help if you get better matchups on the weekend. I think we need to just be much more cutthroat than we are even in the 15s.
Yeah. So what I've noticed, I was going to talk about 12 versus 15. So I don't play 12-team leagues anymore because I'm old and I'm tired. And it's the fact it's so much. There are so many players. But what I've noticed is any level of league depth that you move up, it gets harder and harder to cut players because you feel like this guy is worth something. But if you can kind of break the mindset, like if you played in 10-team mixed leagues and then you move to 12 all of a sudden, you would feel like, I can't cut Max Fried. When as you move from 12 to 15, you would think, well, now I can't cut Max Fried. It's like I want to feel the way Kevin just said it. Like, I know for sure in 12-team leagues, everyone should be cutting way more players. Like, you should cut half your team every week, honestly, in a lot of cases. And I think we overdo it in 15. I know I do with holding on to players, not just the injured players, but these guys who are just kind of like fine. Like, I draft all these guys in the round 15 to 20 who theoretically they play every day and they're okay. There's always somebody who plays and is okay. So like get someone who might be good and just churn through those spots and yeah, cut them if they're hurt. I like what I'm hearing. This is what we're doing. Cut him if he's hurt. Excellent. I feel like we've solved a big problem here. Okay, as far as bench spots, NFBC, you've got your 7 bench spots. Do you have both starting the season and once you get into it, do you have a goal for how many of those are going to be pitchers or relievers who might become closers or hitters to be able to move into the weekend? Like, do you have an ideal setup? Like if nobody's injured, do you know what you want your bench to look like? Lucas?
Yeah, so this has been a bit of a learning experience for me. Years ago, I liked having the 4 hitters on the bench or just to be able to, because you can't switch your pitchers out in the middle of the week. So I thought having the 4 hitters would be able to let you play the best matchups and get the most volume. But with how heavy there is on the pitching hoarding, I kind of like 2 hitters or 3 hitters with the 5 pitchers or the 4 pitchers, just because everyone's kind of agreed, let's just hoard up the pitchers and you don't want to be falling behind. So I've shifted from 4 hitters on the bench to sometimes 2 and probably at most 3. And that's where your multi-position guys will help you sustain those goals.
Yeah. How about you, Kevin?
I'm completely the opposite. I used to want a lot of pitchers on my bench, whether they be speculative closers or guys I picked up a week or 2 early with good matchups coming up, or just someone that I think is my next best guy in line if one of the guys in my starting lineup gets injured or has a horrible matchup. But it's back to that being able to switch out hitters on Friday. To me, too many times I was having the scenario where I needed to change out a hitter on Friday and I didn't have one, and I had 5 pitchers on my bench, and all 5 of them are the same 5 that were on my bench last week. And so I've kind of went the other way to where I lean having more hitters than pitchers.
Okay. So there is no right answer. But so I'm kind of with you in that my lean is always have more pitchers. But then every time I look at the standings at the end of the year, it's crazy how much 1 RBI a week you would have gone from 10th to 1st. And like you get that if you just grind those matchups, those Monday through Friday and the Friday through Sunday, like it's pretty easy to get like 1 extra run or RBI a week or per period if you have that extra batter. That's another place where I used to just not have enough, and I feel like I think that's the way I want to go. Mm-hmm. Especially knowing that I am a pitcher streamer. Like I churn through pitchers on my bench easier than I do with hitters. That's just like a mental block. I have a hard time cutting my hitters. Like I don't have a hard time cutting my pitchers. There's no reason other than that's just the way I do it. But I kind of lean your way, Kevin, that I've run into too many problems when I don't have enough hitters. And I feel like in 1 week, it feels like it's really not a big deal. Whatever, this one guy, only played 2 games. Okay, whatever. But at the end of the year, when you add all this up, getting the 1 run a week or the 1 RBI a week, like, goodness, it matters a crazy ton in the standings. So that's the way I'm trying to go moving forward. A couple of questions from the chat. How many different sources do you guys use for FAAB information? Like, let's kind of take that question to set back to what do you do throughout the week to create your list of players you might want? How much of that is you just watching games going, I like this guy and this guy? How much of it is you listen to a certain set of podcasts or read a certain set of articles? How much information do you take in weekly specific to FAAB? Kevin?
A ton. I do watch a lot of games in person, and as I'll have that one NFBC team where as I'm seeing players throughout the week that I want to take a closer look at. come with the weekend, I go ahead and add them on that team as a pickup, and therefore that way they're there for the weekend. I don't forget about them. I listen to a ton of podcasts. I read all the articles that I can. For a couple of years doing the On the Wire podcast, and I was writing the weekly FAAB article for Pitcher List. I stopped reading other people's articles. I didn't want to be influenced by them when what I was writing or saying, and that was a huge mistake. I was behind. I mean, none of us see everything.
Yeah.
And when you're trying not to look at other people's content, that was a big mistake for me. I got away from that in the middle of last season, and it helped me a lot. I am a big believer in absorb as much information as you can.
Yeah, Lucas.
Yeah, very, very similar to Kevin. I try to listen to as many podcasts as I can and try to read, 3 or 4 5 different websites as far as their FAAB pickups. Just because, like Kevin said, no one has every single right answer. But if you can read as much as you can, hopefully you can have at least an understanding of every player that should be relevant that weekend. So that's one of my goals. I at least know my stance on almost all the relevant pickups. And then, of course, there will be a week in the season where, Louis Varland scooped up for $1 or $2 and you didn't see it coming. But that's why I like to read as much, just so I can, have a general feeling of the market, I guess.
Yeah, it's sort of just a general thing. It's crazy how much fantasy baseball and NFBC in specific, these are not real terms I'm using, like content exists these days. I mean, it's like 5 years ago, even there were like 5 articles and like 4 podcasts. Like there's 412 podcasts about the NFBC right now in January. And during the season, I mean, you could find 200 FAAB articles if you really look hard enough. And they're all pretty good, honestly. I mean, some stuff might be better than others, but like there's so much information out there that, so I try to whittle it down. So I'm not just reading everything.
Yeah.
But I do want to get a whole bunch of viewpoints. One, to not miss anybody.
Yep.
It gives you a good sense of, if every single person, like if someone was not on your radar at all, but every single article you read, every podcast you listen to says, "Oh, I want this guy. I want this guy." Well, that's how you're the only one. Like it's good to get the market pulse that way. But it is just wild how much stuff is out there. Let's see what else is on my list. I know there were things I have not even touched on yet. If anyone has specific questions about non-NFBC leagues and FAAB, like I don't play any non-NFBC leagues anymore, but we are aware a lot of people don't play NFBC. And the FAAB process is different on different sites, but the general idea I think pretty much carries over anywhere. But like I don't want to feel like we're not realizing that some people play on different places. So feel free to ask, hey, what do you do on Fantrax or whatever site you play on? So when the guy running this whole thing asks a question, I feel like you have to ask that, answer that. It's actually a good question. How do you decide between 2 starts with a meh SP? I like that wording versus 1 start of an ace. Now, let's say he doesn't mean ace. If it's an actual ace, you just play the ace. But like, you're a number 3 starter, like a fantasy number 3 starter versus 2 starts from meh. Is that completely just team specific? Where am I in the standings? What the matchups are? Or do you have like sort of a general, at least to start the year when you maybe don't know where you are in the standings? How are you deciding 2 starts from the meh or 1 start from the guy who's actually good? Kevin.
Yeah, you made it harder on me when you said earlier in the year.
Yeah.
Because then it's a tougher decision. And yeah, it's really going to depend on the specific matchups. I'm probably leaning The good number 3 starter, if it's at least a decent matchup, I'm probably leaning that way. I'm still going to protect my ratios and try to set a good base in my ratios at that point. As the season goes on, my tolerance for risk goes up because out of necessity, right? And that's what you brought. Where you are in the standings, the way things are going, you're going to be forced to do things to make up. Whatever you're doing wasn't working, and not only do you have to get better, you have to get exponentially better because you're not just keeping up now. You want to catch up. So early in the year, I'm probably protecting my ratios as long as it's a decent matchup with a one good starter. And but as the season goes on, that risk tolerance has to go up in order to make up ground.
Yeah. To me, it kind of depends on the makeup of the team.
Mm-hmm.
And like kind of like I said, I kind of set my budget knowing what am I going to be doing on this team. So that's the same way I kind of decide early in the year if I go with the 2 starts versus the 1 is if I have really strong pitching, and where I know my ratios are good, like I have 4 solid starters that are going to give me good ratios all year. Like I'm fine to I'm going to throw this 2-start guy, try to get a couple wins. If he has a bad week, I'm fine. So it depends on the team for me. Generally, I have sort of a problem with using too many bad 2-start pitchers. Like that's sort of one of my favorite things to do. I like to eat ice cream and play really bad 2-start pitchers. Like those are my things. But I think the better answer is usually the 1-start good pitcher early on. I like this question from Brooklyn Mashers. Great name, by the way. And this is sort of kind of like with the Ellie De La Cruz thing, like how you change your FAAB when you're in contention for an overall contest. Like everything you do with FAAB should be a little different in something like the NFBC main event versus a standalone league or like a higher dollar entry where maybe there's an overall, but it's not as big of a piece of the pie. Like, how do you decide, okay, I'm just going first place or nothing with this versus kind of playing a little safer and playing for the league? Like, is there a point in the year at which you might switch, or early on, are you just like throwing caution to the wind? Lucas, since you won an overall last year, you get to tell us that.
Yeah, for me, and this is just my style. Everyone's very different as far as what works for them. I feel like you can win an overall even not having crazy players like Mondesi or Joey Gallo. I know those guys are several years old for those types of references, but I feel like chipping away every week, having excellent 14 hitters and great 9 pitchers, it's a team effort compared to football where, a Cooper Kupp, that's the guy you need to win a few years ago for an overall. So, obviously going all in on a pitcher that works out, that's important. But for me, I'm not really going to be throwing caution to the wind for an overall because I think it's really a team effort where a lot of decisions are going to come together for that to happen.
That was very post-game press conference. It's a team effort out there, guys.
Yeah.
But I think you're totally right. Yeah. How about you, Kevin?
Yeah, I agree 100%. I think I think there's a common misconception, and we hear about it this time of year. I need to take more chances if I'm looking at an overall, and I don't agree with that at all. I agree with what Lucas said.
Yeah, boring and steady wins the race.
Absolutely.
So we're almost out of time. Do either of you guys have anything sort of that we haven't covered? Like you final thoughts, the greatest wisdom of your life? It doesn't have to be baseball related, like deep thoughts with Lucas Biery. Anything we've missed?
One thing that I wanted to throw out, like at First Pitch Arizona, we had heard that on average your bids are overboard by twice the runner up. So I think dropping out those bids within reason so you can have a bigger budget to take a swing or two, like Dave said, that's going to be something I'm going to be focused on. I mean, I spent, $25-30 on Alec Burleson as a streamer. That was a huge waste. Just that type of stuff, keep it a little bit more within reason on the bids.
Yeah. Kevin, words of wisdom for the children.
There's a ton of things to look at if you're trying to keep track of every little thing, but it's worth it. I talked to Lucas about this in Arizona. I talked to Nick Pollock about it in Arizona. It's something you brought up in Arizona, Dave, 2 years ago on the NFBC panel when you told Steve Weimer it didn't really matter what his strategies were because no one was going to outwork him.
Mhm.
I have found that to be true. My most successful seasons have been the seasons I've spent the most time at this, and I couldn't agree with that point you made a couple of years ago more.
Great. Yeah, I'll leave that as the final word. Mine would have been similar. Like you can have all the great strategy in the world, but especially with FAAB, like he who spends the more time on FAAB is going to do better. Like there's really no secret behind it. Like work harder than the person next to you and you'll probably do better.